This video is about the simplification of kanji over time. Alright, so we looked at language reform in the last video, and I mentioned the simplification of kanji. What does that mean? Well, for centuries, the Chinese and the Japanese, and frankly the Koreans who were using kanji, had come up with and were using simplifications, informal, unofficial simplifications of kanji when they were writing by hand. So this was not just a modern development. This was something that had been done informally, unofficially for quite a long time. In the 20th century, the Japanese decided to formally adopt most of the simplification of kanji. And there are four basic types. There are four basic ways in which a kanji might be simplified, and that's what we're going to be looking at in detail today. But before I get there, I also want to mention that the simplification process for the Chinese on mainland China takes a different path. So if you have studied Mandarin and you're familiar with the simplification that we find in the People's Republic of China, this is not the same animal, and I'll be giving you an example at the end of today's lecture of how those characters can differ. Okay, the first type of simplification is called calligraphic simplification. These are meant to reflect what the grass script or the cursive writing of that character, think back to the calligraphy unit, what that would look like. So if we were writing with a brush and we were dragging our brush across the page and not making clear each individual stroke, what might that character look like? So for example, gaku, this is a kanji I'm hoping everybody knows, learning. Originally, in its unsimplified or its complex form, looked like this. That top part has a lot of lines in it, an awful lot of brush strokes. If we wrote it with a brush and we dragged the brush, you can see how eventually all of those separate lines could be construed as something as simple as those three. Here's another example. This one's not quite so dramatic. Kan, if we take that top part and we write it in grass script, we might end up with something that looks a little simpler. Here's ten, jitensha no ten. The left side of this character doesn't change, but the right side does. If we were writing this part very quickly, we might end up with something that looks like this. Here's su or kazu, a number. Here the right-hand side doesn't change, but the left-hand side, if written in grass script, might end up looking something like this. Now, this character, admittedly, is an example of a little bit of fudge in describing calligraphic simplification, because if you look at the left-hand side, you'll notice right away that these are really two of the 214 kanji radicals. We've got rice on the top and we've got woman on the bottom, right? And on the left-hand side, the woman is there too, that piece, right? So it's not as if these calligraphic simplifications came up with new kanji radicals. Really, what happens in the calligraphic simplification is the closest approximation within the realm of the 214 kanji radicals is the thing that gets substituted. So here, that is kome or rice. And finally, here we have to. So to goes from, or political party is what it means. To goes from having kuro at the bottom to having two legs. That was just easier to do, and it's close to what it would look like if you were doing grass script. So that's calligraphic simplification. The second kind of simplification is homophonous, and this may mentally take you back to the lecture on different kinds of kanji. These simplifications substitute a homophonous component, regardless of its meaning. Its meaning is not important. Remember the kanji that we were looking at, the vast majority, 90% or more of the kanji, when we were looking at types of kanji, fell into this kind of category where the left-hand side or the right-hand side, one part of the kanji gives you a hint about the meaning of the character, and the other part of the kanji gives you a hint about the reading of the character. That's what we're looking at here. So this character, the left-hand side gives us a hint about what it means. It has something to do with speech. And the right-hand side is just there for the meaning, or sorry, the reading. So in this case, someone had the great idea looking at this and saying, you know, we don't need that complicated part to represent the sound. We can use something simpler that can represent the sound. And so that's what they did. Here also, the middle part, it's pronounced E, is the thing that indicates how the character is read. Well, this middle part can also be read E, so why not use that one instead? There are fewer brush strokes. Generally speaking, simplification means finding some way of writing a character with fewer brush strokes. Here's another example in which the entire character is eliminated, and instead something else with an approximation of sound is used. Here's a real extreme example. That whole middle part, there's a lot of strokes in there, and someone said, hey, you know, we don't need to do that. Why don't we just stick with this? Because it represents, in this case, the sound cho. Both of them represent the sound cho, and that's what they needed. Now, one of the problems with homophonous simplification is that in many characters' case, it can end up being simplified as the same one. In other words, you take discrete characters and you end up simplifying them into essentially what is the same thing. So, for example, here we have the character ben, bento no ben. But actually, if you look it up in Nelson's, you'll discover that it has a tremendous number of meanings, and one of the reasons why it has a tremendous number of meanings is that in a previous life, it was either this kanji, or this one, or this one, or this one. They all got simplified into that one on the right. Now, they're not used all that often, so I think at this point nobody even remembers that that used to be 4 separate kanji, but there it is. Okay. The third kind of simplification is a partial simplification. In this case, only part of a complex kanji is used to represent the whole character. In other words, somebody looked at a complex kanji and said, you know, even a part of that kanji is unique. Why don't we just use the fewest number of brush strokes and stick with whatever's unique? For example, koe, voice. That left-hand, upper left-hand part, which is actually a kangshi radical, is unique. And somebody said, you know, we don't need this part, which is another radical, and we don't need this part, which is another radical. Let's just use this alone to represent koi. And so that's the simplified version of it. Doku is in dokuritsu as in independence. Again, here, someone realized, you know, we don't need this part and we don't need this part in order to maintain a unique nature to the character, and so this became the simplified version of it. I, as in igaku, as in medicine, upper left-hand side is unique. You don't need the right part and you don't need the bottom. You can just use this and still have a unique and much more simple character. Ken, prefecture. The left-hand side works. You don't need the right-hand side. Why not just do what they have on the left? And finally, go, number. You don't need that right-hand part. Just go with that left-hand part, and you still have a workable kanji. I think partial simplification is pretty straightforward stuff. The fourth simplification is tricky. It's not really easily categorized in any particular way. These simplifications, frankly and sadly, are best simply memorized. You just got to learn them. You can't, there's no trick to it, okay? Here's an example, karada, body. This is probably a kanji that you've seen before. It's onyomi is tai. Originally, it looked like this. It's a bit of a mental stretch for me to figure out how that happened. Really? But it did. Ataeru, to provide, used to look like this. I suppose this simplified version looks kind of like that part in the middle, but it's certainly not the same. Tsukusu, to exhaust, like to exhaust a supply. That one really ended up quite different also. Okay, I mentioned right at the beginning of this lecture that the simplification process in China was not the same as it was in Japan. So let me show you an example of this. On the left-hand side, we have the traditional characters that are still used in Taiwan. In the middle column are the simplified versions that are used in Japan, and if you're using kanji or hanja in Korea, the ones that would be used there. Those are really traditional. For centuries, people have been abbreviating kanji like that, and then that abbreviated form became official in the 20th century, in Japan at least. In the PRC, however, these more traditional forms that people had been using didn't necessarily become implemented. And the simplification process in the PRC was more wide sweeping than it was in Japan. So in other words, there are more characters in the PRC that got simplified than there were in Japan when the government made these decisions. So you can see the difference between the traditional form, the what I'm going to call sort of the standard simplification, the thing that people were writing for centuries before it got standardized. And then the creation out of the PRC. These simplifications in the PRC are all relatively new creations. Okay. These, if you're reading a handwritten text, these characters here, if you're reading a handwritten text from even the 19th century or before that was done in Japan, you may find these simplifications already there. Okay. The next lecture will be on kana.